Hey, squirrel listeners, we're on chapter 25 of Rilla of Ingleside called Shirley Goes. And I surely don't want Shirley to go. No, Woodrow, there will be no peace without victory, said Susan, sticking her knitting needle viciously through President Wilson's name in the newspaper column. We Canadians mean to have peace and victory too. If it pleases you, Woodrow, can have the peace without the victory. And Susan stalked off to bed with the comfortable consciousness of having got the better of the argument with the president. But a few days later she rushed to Mrs. Blythe in red-hot excitement. Mrs. Doctor, dear, what do you think? A phone message has just come through from Charlottetown that Woodrow Wilson has sent that German ambassador man to the right about at last. They tell me that means war. So I begin to think that Woodrow's heart is in the right place after all, wherever his head may be, and I'm going to commandeer a little sugar and celebrate the occasion with some fudge. Despite the howls of the food board, I thought that submarine business would bring things to a crisis. I told Cousin Sophia so when she said it was the beginning of the end for the Allies. Don't let the doctor hear of the fudge, Susan, said Anne with a smile. You know he has laid down very strict rules for us along the lines of economy the government has asked for. Yes, Mrs. Doctor, dear, and a man should be master in his own household, and his women folk should bow to his decrees. I flatter myself that I am becoming quite efficient and economizing. Susan had taken to using certain German terms with killing effect, but one can exercise a little gumption on the quiet now and then. Shirley was wishing for some of my fudge the other day, the Susan brand, as he called it, and I said, the first victory there is to celebrate, I shall make you some. I consider this news quite equal to a victory, and what the doctor does not know will never grieve him. I take the whole responsibility, Mrs. Doctor, dear, so do not you vex your conscience. Susan spoiled Shirley shamelessly that winter. He came home from Queens every weekend, and Susan had all his favorite dishes for him, insofar as she could evade or wheedle the doctor and waited on him hand and foot. Though she talked war constantly to everyone else, she never mentioned it to him or before him. But she watched him like a cat watching a mouse, and when the German retreat from the Batum salient began and continued, Susan's exultation was linked up with something deeper than anything she expressed. Surely the end was in sight, would come now before anyone else could go. Things are coming our way at last. We have got the Germans on the run, she boasted. The United States has declared war at last, as I always believed they would, in spite of Woodrow's gift for letter writing. And you will see they will go into it with a vim, since I understand that's their habit when they do start. And we've got the Germans on the run, too. The States mean well, moaned Cousin Sophia, but all the vim in the world cannot put them on the fighting line this spring, and the Allies will be finished before that. The Germans are just luring them all. That man Simmons says their retreat has put the Allies in a hole. That man Simons has said more than he will ever live to make good, retorted Susan. I do not worry myself about his opinion as long as Lloyd George is Premier of England. He will not be bamboozled, and that you may tie to. Things look good to me. The U.S. is in the war, and we've got Kut and Baghdad now back. And I would not be surprised to see the Allies in Berlin by June, and the Russians too, since they've got rid of the Tsar. That, in my opinion, was a good piece of work. The time will show it if it is, said Cousin Sophia, who would have been very indignant if anyone had told her that she would rather see Susan put to shame as a seer than a successful overthrow of tyranny or even the march of the Allies down Unter den Linden. But then the woes of the Russian people were quite unknown to Cousin Sophia, while this aggravating, optimistic Susan was an ever-present thorn in her side. Just at that moment, Shirley was sitting on the edge of the table in the living room, swinging his legs. A brown, ruddy, wholesome lad from top to toe, every inch of him, was saying coolly, "Mother and Dad, I was 18 last Monday. Don't you think it's about time I joined up?" The pale mother looked at him. "2 of my sons have gone, and 1 will never return. Must I give you 2, Shirley?" The age-old cry, "Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and you will take Benjamin away." How the mothers of the Great War echoed the old patriotic's moan of so many centuries agone. Agone. "You wouldn't have me a slacker, Mother. I can get into the flying corps. What say, Dad?" The doctor's hands were not quite steady as he folded up the powders he was concocting for Abby Flagg's rheumatism. He had known this moment was coming, yet he was not altogether prepared for it. He answered slowly, "I won't try to hold you back from what you believe to be your duty, but you must not go unless your mother says you may." Shirley said nothing more. He was not a lad of many words. Anne did not say anything more just then, either. She was thinking of little Joyce's grave in the old burying ground over harbor. Little Joyce, who would have been a woman now had she lived, of the white cross in France, and the splendid gray eyes of the little boy who had been taught his first lessons of duty and loyalty at her knee, of Jim in the terrible trenches, of Nan and Di and Rilla waiting, while the golden years of youth passed by, and she wondered if she could bear any more. She thought not. Surely she had given enough. Yet that night she told Shirley that he might go. They did not tell Susan right away. She did not know it until a few days later. Shirley presented himself in the kitchen in his aviation uniform. Susan didn't make half the fuss she had made when Jim and Walter had gone. She said stonily, "So they're going to take you too?" "Take me? No, I'm going, Susan. Got to." Susan sat down by the table, folded her knotted old hands that had grown warped and twisted, working for the Ingleside children to still their shaking, and said, "Yes, you must go. I did not see once why such things must be, but I can see now." "You're a brick, Susan," said Shirley. He was relieved that she took it so coolly. He had been a little afraid with the boy's horror of a scene. He went out whistling gaily, but half an hour later, when pale Anne Blythe came in, Susan was still sitting there. "Mrs. Doctor, dear," said Susan, making an admission she would once have died rather than make, "I feel very old. Jim and Walter were yours, but Shirley is mine, and I cannot bear to think of him flying. His machine crashing down, the life crushed out of his body, the dear little body I nursed and cuddled when he was a wee baby." "Susan, don't," cried Anne. "Oh, Mrs. Doctor, dear, I beg your pardon. I ought not to have said anything like that out loud. I sometimes forget that I resolved to be a heroine. This has shaken me a little. But I will not forget myself again. Only if things do not go as smoothly in the kitchen for a few days, I hope you will make due allowance for me." "At least," said poor Susan, forcing a grim smile in a desperate effort to recover lost standing, "at least flying is a clean job. He will not get so dirty and messed up as he would in the trenches, and that is well, for he's always been such a tidy child." So Shirley went, not radiantly as to high adventure like Jim, and not in the white flame of sacrifice like Walter, but in a cool business-like nod, as one doing as of one doing something rather dirty and disagreeable that had just got to be done. He kissed Susan for the first time since he was 5 years old and said, "Goodbye, Susan." "Mother, Susan, my little brown boy," said Susan. "I wonder," she thought bitterly as she looked down at the doctor's sorrowful face, If you remember how you spanked him once when he was a baby, I'm thankful I have nothing like that on my conscience now." The doctor did not remember the old discipline, but before he put on his hat to go out on his rounds of calls, he stood for a moment in the great silent living room that had once been full of children's laughter. Our last son, he said aloud, a good, sturdy, sensible lad now, too. Always reminded me of my father. I suppose I ought to be proud that he wanted to go. I was so proud when Jim went, even when Walter went, but our house has left us desolate. "I've been thinking, Doctor," old Sandy of the Upper Glen said to him that afternoon, "that your house will be seeming very big the day." Highland Sandy's quaint phrase struck the doctor as perfectly expressive. Ingleside did seem very big and empty that night. Yet Shirley had not been away all winter except for 2 weekends, and had always been a quiet fellow. Even when home, was it because he had been the only one left, that his going seemed to leave such a huge blank, that every room seemed vacant and deserted, that the very trees on the lawn seemed to be trying to comfort each other with caresses of freshly budding boughs for the loss of the last of the little lads who had been rocked under them in childhood? Susan worked very hard and late into the night. When she had wound the kitchen clock and put Dr. Jekyll out, none too gently, she stood for a little while on the doorstep, looking down the glen which lay tranced in faint silvery light from a sinking young moon. But Susan did not see the familiar hills and harbor. She was looking at the aviation camp in Kingsport, where Shirley was that night. "He called me Mother Susan," she was thinking. "Well, all our menfolk have gone now. Jim and Walter and Shirley and Jerry and Carl, and none of them had to be driven to it, so we had a right to be proud. But pride," Susan sighed bitterly, "pride is cold company, and that there is no gainsaying." The moon sank lower into the black cloud in the west. The glen went out in an eclipse of sudden shadow, and thousands of miles away the Canadian boys in khaki, the living and the dead, were in possession of Vimy Ridge. No, Vimy. Or Vimy. Vimy Ridge is a name written in crimson and gold on the Canadian annals of the Great War. "The British couldn't take it and the French couldn't take it," said a German prisoner to his captors, "but you Canadians are such fools that you don't know when a place can't be taken." Yeah. So the fools took it and paid the price. Jerry Meredith was seriously wounded at Vimy Ridge, shot in the back, the telegram said. "Poor Nan," said Mrs. Blythe when the news came. She thought of her own happy girlhood in the old Green Gables. There had been no tragedy like this in it. How the girls of today had to suffer. When Nan came home from Redmond 2 weeks later, her face showed what those weeks had meant to her. John Meredith, too, seemed to have grown old suddenly in them. Faith did not come home. She was on her way across the Atlantic as a VAD. Di had tried to wring from her father's consent to going also, but had been told that for her mother's sake it could not be given. So Di, after a flying visit home, went back to her Red Cross work in Kingsport. The Mayflowers bloomed in the secret nooks of Rainbow Valley. Rilla was watching for them. Jim had once taken his mother to the earliest Mayflowers. Walter brought them to her when Jim was gone. Last spring, Shirley had sought them out for her now. Rilla thought she must take the boy's place in this, but before she had discovered any, Bruce Meredith came to Ingleside one twilight with his hands full of delicate pink sprays. He stalked up the steps of the veranda and laid them on Mrs. Blythe's lap. "Because Shirley isn't here to bring them," he said in his funny, shy, blunt ways. "And you thought of this, you darling," said Anne, her lips quivering, as she looked at the stocky, black-browed little chap standing before her with his hands thrust into his pockets. I wrote Jim today and told him not to worry about you not getting your Mayflowers," said Bruce seriously, "'cause I'd see to that. And I told him I would be 10 pretty soon. Now it won't be very long before I'll be 18. And then I'll go help him fight and maybe let him come home for a rest while I took his place. I wrote Jerry, too. Jerry's getting better, you know." "Is he? Have you heard any good news about him?" "Yes, Mother had a letter today, and it said he was out of danger." "Yay." "Oh, thank God," murmured Mrs. Blythe in a half-whisper. Bruce looked at her curiously. "That's what Father said when Mother told him. But when I said the other day, when I found out Mrs. Meade's dogs hadn't hurt my kitten, I thought he had shaken it to death, you know. Father looked awful solemn and said I must never say that again about a kitten. But I couldn't understand why, Mrs. Blythe. I felt awkward, thankful. It must have been God that saved Stripey, because that Meade dog had enormous jaws, and oh, how it shook poor Stripey. And so I couldn't thank him. And so why couldn't I thank him? Of course," added Bruce reminiscently. "Maybe I said it too loud, 'cause I was awful glad and excited when I found Stripey was all right. I most shouted it, Mrs. Blythe. Maybe if I'd said it sort of whispery like you and your father." Hang on. "Like you and your father, it would have been all right. Do you know, Mrs. Blythe?" Bruce dropped to a whispery tone, edging a little nearer to Anne. What I would like to do to the Kaiser if I could." "What would you like to do, laddie?" "Norman Reese said in school today that he would like to tie the Kaiser to a tree and set cross dogs to worrying him," said Bruce gravely. "And Emily Flagg said she would take to put him in a cage and poke sharp things into it at him. And they all said things like that. But Mrs. Blythe, Bruce took a little square paw print out of his pocket and put it on earnestly." Okay. Lost my spot. I see. Bruce took a little square paw out of his and put it earnestly on Anne's knee. "I would like to turn the Kaiser into a good man, a very good man, all at once if I could. That's what I would do. Don't you think, Mrs. Blythe, that would be the very worstest punishment of all?" "Bless the child," said Susan. How do you make out that world would be any kind of punishment for that wicked fiend?" "Don't you see," said Bruce, looking levelly at Susan out of his blacky blue eyes. "If he was turned into a good man, he would understand how dreadful the things he had done are. And he would feel so terrible about it, he would be more unhappy and miserable than he could ever be in any other way. He would feel just awful, and he would go on feeling like that forever." Yes, Bruce clenched his hair and fists. Let's see. Clenched his hands. Oh, where I got the fist. Bruce clenched his hand and nodded his head emphatically. "Yes, I would make the Kaiser a good man. That is what I would do. It would serve him exactly right." And that's all of chapter 25. Chapter 26 is, oh my goodness, Susan has a proposal of marriage. Susan needs her own a man, I reckon, and her own place of her own. Well, thanks for listening, and I'll be live at 5 today. Have no idea what we're going to do. Whip Wednesday, I could come show you about 5 million whips. Oh, we'll jaw, and I don't know if we'll do trivia or not. We might. We'll see. We'll see what y'all want to get up to. Love ya, and be sweet. Don't be ugly. Love you much. Bye-bye.